You know, you have certainly led a very interesting life, Dr. Uhl, beginning as at a young age being groomed, I guess is the proper word, for the priesthood by your parents and
Well,
expected to go into the priesthood. That's a better way of saying it.
unquestionably, so I don't know if I would call it groomed. It was simply my mother's expectation, and that was a very early expectation, and I knew nothing besides that. My oldest brother was destined to run the family farm. I was destined to go to the altar as a family priest, and that was that. There was no question in my young mind that this was not the thing to do. I guess we could say my mom had a very early vocation for me.
Okay, and I guess, you know, what struck me, and I've got to confess, I've only gotten through the first three chapters of your book. I'm trying to read through it as quickly as possible, but I've got a lot of irons in the fire at the time being. But it's a very interesting book. But I guess what struck me from the first three chapters is that you discuss something that probably the most famous atheist out there alive today, Richard Dawkins, talks about, and you talk about it quite a bit within those first three chapters, that what happens to children before they're of the age of reasoning is that they are effectively brainwashed through tradition and whatnot, and family and friends and the church. They are brainwashed into a belief system that they probably don't have the intellectual capability to reject. Is that pretty much sum it up as the way you think?
It's a very good summary, Mark, and it's probably one of the most common crimes of society is that parents, whether they're well educated or not, you don't have to have any kind of licensing or education to become a parent, and yet this parent has almost total right, culturally speaking, to form this child's mental information bank, if you will. And so prejudices and myths and fantasies of the past are passed on to the next generation without much of any censorship. And certainly a little child is not capable of censoring. First of all, the child is totally dependent on mom and dad for eating and security and that kind of thing. So a trust level, an appropriate trust level, it would be, that the child would trust the parent completely. And the parent has a tremendous responsibility to be worthy of that trust and refuse to pass on old fantasies that may have worked for grandma and grandpa,
Sure.
but no longer in our scientific age works so well. But the child himself or herself at that early pre-rational stage simply cannot censor those inputs and therefore can be victimized by them.
The problem, the problem that I see with that, let me interrupt you just a second, is that you're certainly not suggesting, as some have said, that, look, this is a form of child abuse. You're certainly not saying, and I wouldn't, living in a free country, in a free society, I wouldn't want to say, we're going to criminalize teaching children about religion or about some supernatural being who both of us don't believe exists. We're certainly not going to criminalize that. It only seems like the only answer you could have is some kind of deprogramming later in life.
Well, deprogramming or rational education, does that sound a little more practical?
Yeah.
If we had good scientific education, the child would deprogram himself or herself. When reason takes over, the reason has a way of contacting reality that fantasy does not.
Right.
And so the individual thinker gets good payoff for being rational rather than being mystical or fantastical or emotionally driven, that kind of thing. So good scientific critical thinking education is the answer to this. In my wildest dreams, sometimes I have a desire for to find a law firm with the balls to attack some of this early education that gives a parent almost, well, excuse the expression, godlike power over this poor little intellect that can't defend itself against stupidities, that grew out of the past. Now, the people like the fantasy of Santa Claus, for example,
Sure.
and that's nice and warm because of all the neat associations with it from childhood. But the child can outgrow that easily, because as soon as that child reaches the ability to reason, they see the evidence that this is, the evidence for Santa being a total, mythical story.
Sure.
But they can't do that with supernatural stuff.
Sure.
Okay? You cannot disprove the supernatural. The child can disprove Santa Claus, but he can't disprove the Trinity. He can't disprove the existence of a supernatural.
When you say you'd like to find the law firm with the balls, your words, not mine, to sue people over teaching their children about religion, I'm going to guess that's probably a law firm with very few clients. But look, let me ask you something.
Right.
I've gotten through the historical aspects of you being a priest, a young priest, and staying with the priesthood through 11 years, and at some point starting to have substantial doubts in terms of the logical proof of God, or the logical proof of a creator who created this whole thing. I'm curious, because I've only gotten through 3 chapters in the book, and maybe you address it in later chapters. Were your parents still alive when you made the decision to basically quit the priesthood and renounce your faith? Because I made that decision in my 20s and told my dad, and I got to say, it was one of the things that I think destroyed my father emotionally.
My father had died a few years before I was ordained.
Okay.
But my mother, of course, was alive at that time, and probably the high point in her life was my first Mass, when her son, became publicly known as the family priest.
Mm-hmm.
When I announced to her, well, let me back up just a moment.
Okay.
To a very joyful situation on Mother's Day in 1967. We were all gathered around Mom's table at her place, and around this, it was a totally joyful day. And this is when I had planned to tell them that I was leaving the priesthood and the monastery.
Oh, God.
Well, speaking of balls, I didn't have the balls to do it, because it was such a joyful occasion. There was no way that I felt that I could destroy that at that time. However, during the next week, I did go around to all of my siblings, and I shared with them my plans, that I was leaving and that kind of thing. Now, getting back to Mom, she still loves me, or loved me. She's dead now, of course. Mm-hmm. But she still loved me, and she fell in love with my wife later on. But that's jumping ahead. But going back to that week after the Mother's Day, at the end of the week, when I was ready to drive off, I can still see her carrying out armloads of bedclothes from her storage, and laughing through her tears, she said, "And I thought I was finished setting up my kids in housekeeping."